Hello everybody. Today I wanted to speak to you on what's binding to believe in Judaism. What does one have to believe to be considered a kosher Jew? And this is, I think, the most important question that people fail to ask any of their teachers today. Because what typically happens, or the approach that's typically taken, especially when someone is new to Judaism, whether he or she is desiring to convert or an ethnic Jew is deciding to return, is that if a rabbi said it, then it's binding. In other words, it's obligatory to believe. This is what my religion is made up of. Now, is that true? Is this what Torah teaches? Is this what the Talmud teaches? Now, what is true is that this is the method used by the vast majority of rabbis, particularly on YouTube, which is an ideology made famous by mystical, Kabbalistic, Hasidic forms of Judaism. But friends, I'm here to tell you that this is not the case. Actually, the way Judaism functions from a rabbinic perspective is that Torah is the basis, the 5 books, the Chumash, and what we call halakha, which are nothing more than the rulings of the Great Court, also known as the oral law or rabbinic law. Now that sounds pretty simple enough. However, the problem that arises is when people cannot distinguish halakha from midrash, from agadah, folklore and legend. How does one distinguish between midrash and halakha? Well, anything found in rabbinic literature that is not of a legal nature is considered agadah, what later became known as midrash. Folklore, ideas that in many cases are beautiful and inspiring and life-changing, and many times they just don't speak to us, mainly because they constantly contradict themselves, because they were never meant to be taken seriously. In other words, as the Rambam writes, that the basis of believing in what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh is Parshat Shoftim, in the rulings of the judges, of the Shoftim, the judges who sat on the Sanhedrin, who we call Chazal. Now, their authority was limited to what we do, not what we believe. Now, this, amongst the poskim, was a generally understood idea. As a matter of fact, one could say that was the initial reason for codifications of Jewish law. What made the Rambam famous was that he codified all of Torah Sheba'al Peh in 14 volumes. In other words, he extracted law from folklore to help us act out our obligations in a uniform manner. That's it. But the problem that arises today is that many rabbis take the statements, the legends, the poems, and make those themselves obligatory to believe. Now, if you ask the average rabbi if he believes in every Agadah as objectively true, he'll say, of course not. That would be absurd, mainly because many times they contradict themselves, which means that he doesn't expect you to believe in them either, or he shouldn't expect you to believe in them either. Now, what has occurred, again, mainly in the converts and returnees section of Judaism, many teachers, in an attempt more to indoctrinate than to teach, begin teaching these legends, these tales, as authoritative, as obligatory to believe, in order to instill a certain form of thinking in the individual, whether it's to keep them away from other movements, or in cases like Hasidut and other mystical forms of Judaism, an attempt to make another chassid. But friends, it's time to put that aside and start thinking like a posek, not like a peasant. It's time to get serious about your learning. Whenever you pick up a book, whenever you pick up a sefer, ask, what weight does this carry in Judaism? Are these ideas optional to believe? Because one principle you should not lose sight of is that things that are optional to believe are not worth making sense of. But I think that the rabbis who propose these ideas are very well aware of this, because this also goes for metaphysical ideas. No one would waste their time in mystical pursuits that are in some way considered subjective. No, if anyone follows a religious or mystical movement, they want to be confident, they want to be assured that this is a building block to my religion, something that is not only inspired but obligatory and objective in that belief system. and not just fluff. And one of the reasons I chose to give this talk tonight is that many times when discussing Judaism, especially with newcomers to Judaism, they'll start quoting the Ramchal. They'll start quoting all these midrashim, trying to build a theological monster to progress a certain theological idea. Now, if someone wanted to do that for themselves, yes, that they were convinced that these things were true or these things spoke to them, that's one thing. But to teach this or teach these ideas as obligatory on all of Israel or anyone coming to Israel, that's where the problem begins. That's where they take some ideas that may be beautiful and make them ugly. And unfortunately, these are the tools and the methods used by many rabbis to brainwash. And this is why I've always encouraged my students to stick with the academic forms of Judaism. Listen to classes given by rabbis for rabbis, and steer away from these cults we see online, not just for Gentiles, even for Jews. For example, in the Gentile camp, we see these methods used when teaching the Noahide laws or when offering Noahideism to Gentiles as an alternative to conversion. The teachers will bring down every story in the book and never tell the students that they are only opinion. That's it, friends. Only opinion. Think about it. At least regarding the Noahide movement or the Ger Toshav movement, the only portion within this whole movement that's obligatory to believe, from a rabbinic perspective, is that 7 laws were developed by the court to adjudicate Gentiles living on Jewish lands. And honestly, that's it. Now, that's just a drop in the bucket of what's called Noahideism today. Why? Because virtually every other segment of the movement deals with optional metaphysical concepts, like who gets to heaven for keeping what, as well as the many, many, many stories that they add to the narrative of the Torah, teaching that 6 laws were given to Adam, the 7th law given to Noah, that there was a yeshiva that taught these 7 laws, that all the patriarchs, obviously before Sinai, were keeping these 7 laws, that an angel came and gave the laws to Adam on how the keeping of these 7 laws will usher in the redemption. All these metaphysical ideas which are optional to believe. And this also goes with the Kiruv rabbis on YouTube. Virtually everything is about reward and punishment, heaven and hell, reincarnation, that if you break Shabbat in this life, you'll come back as an invalid in the next life. Friends, we're teaching people to think like peasants and not like poskim. Anyone who opens up Shas will constantly see the separation. Chazal went out of their way to make a distinction between what's from the Torah, what's from the rabbis, what's a halacha, and what's just a garata. Instead of making this into a theological cholent and stating all this was given on Mount Sinai. And if you disagree with all this, you're disagreeing with Chazal, and you're disagreeing with God, you're disagreeing with Torah, and you're disagreeing with the oral law. And the reason I think the phrase, don't think like a peasant, but a posek, is so catchy is because this is what it took to be a posek. To have a community rely on your piskei halacha. In other words, what made the job of these scholars difficult was that when trying to decide a final ruling to a given subject in a sea of other rulings, was being able to separate who said what, which ruling came first or last, and the most important question of it all, where did it come from? Why? Because the oral law could only come from a handful of places. If not, it could not be considered halakha, which includes the Mishnah, as well as both Talmuds, Talmud Yerushalmi and Talmud Bavli, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Toseftot, and the Mechilta. And that's it. And that's all. That is where oral law stems from. So if you notice that your teacher has you spending your time only reading Kabbalah, Hasidus, Musar, find yourself a new rabbi. Because if you're like me and you're late to the game, in other words, you weren't born into this religion, you didn't grow up into a religious education, you don't have time to waste. You have to focus on source material. And then and only then, when proficient and able to distinguish the meat from the fluff, can you study all these other subjective works, what's called opinion literature. And what is source literature? What is source material? The 5 books of Moses and halakha. In simplest forms, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and Mishneh Torah. And that's it. Master these 2 things, and you will know more than 99% of the rabbis out there. And it's not that I'm against metaphysical ideas or mystical Judaism, but that for something to be authoritative within mysticism in Judaism, it must stem from the 5 books of Moses. Why? Because the authority was never given to the court to rule on mystical issues or metaphysical issues, but just legal ones. What we do, what's called halakha le'maaseh. Now, do they have mystical opinions? Of course they do. We all do. But they knew enough not to teach it like law, like something obligatory to believe. So today, I want you to take an account of your beliefs, what you hold true, what you hold dear religiously, and ask yourself, where does it come from? If everything you believe from a metaphysical perspective appears outside of the Torah, then you're holding optional beliefs. And everything that you feel bound to keep doesn't have its source within the 5 books of Moses and the sources of rabbinic literature that we just described, the Mishnah, Talmud Yerushalmi, Talmud Bavli, the Toseftot, the Sefra, the Sefri, the Mechilta, then you're keeping optional practices. That's it. It's quite simple if you think about it. It's a lot simpler than walking around thinking that every rabbi has the authority to just establish any new metaphysical concept and expect you to embrace it. Or worse, feeling you have to believe every legend and tale that appears in the Talmud or rabbinic literature, what is known as Agadah. That's it. Friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.